What's up, everybody? Michael Walsh here. So I want to talk about JDM and what he has to gain this weekend should he be able to beat Islam Makhachev. Because it's pretty obvious what Islam has to gain. You know, he's chasing double champ status. He's chasing like definitive, inarguable pound-for-pound status. He's possibly chasing GOAT status. You know, like for me, I still wouldn't put him at number one if he's able to beat JDM and get that second belt, but he would climb in the rankings for me, and I already have him top 10, so he wouldn't be far off at that point. Some people already have him at number one, and I think that's unearned. But, you know, for those people, if he gets a second belt, you know, it's only cementing his case. And for some people who rank him a little higher than I do, this win would be enough to, you know, put him at number one, to put him ahead of GSP, ahead of John Jones, ahead of Volkanovski, ahead of those kinds of people. Like, this win could do it for him. So that's what he's after, and that's what he has to gain. But what will JDM gain if he can beat Islam? Now, I think that's a bit of a tricky question because I think it depends on what happens for the rest of JDM's career, or at least for the next few years. And what do I mean by that? So JDM has the potential to be a reigning champion. He's very skilled. He's pretty young. You know, he's clearly improving. If he can beat Islam, you know, he's got some very difficult challenges ahead of him because welterweight's experiencing some pretty good turnover at the moment. But at the same time, it's not the deepest division. It's kind of like middleweight, or frankly, it's kind of like bantamweight. You know, there's some really good guys at the very top, but once you get past them, there's not a lot left. So you can imagine a scenario where JDM can beat Islam and then spend the next 2 years or so getting another like 3 defenses. And all of a sudden, boom, he's like in the same position Merab is in, where it's like you can either fight scrubs, or you can do rematches, or you can go up and wait. Like, those are your options, you know? So should he do that, I think the win over Islam in hindsight will be looked at very favorably. However, if he beats Islam and then just goes on to lose, you know, like imagine a scenario where like, you know, he beats Islam and then he loses to Sean Brady or something like that. And especially if the person he loses to also goes on to lose either in their like first defense or maybe their second defense. So like let's play out a scenario. JDM beats Islam. JDM loses to Sean Brady. Sean Brady loses to Ian Gary, and Ian Gary loses to Shavkat in a rematch, or he loses to Morales or something. Like if there's a bit of that sort of hot potato thing, and especially if JDM loses his very next fight, I think this win over Islam will just kind of age poorly. Like, it won't do much for him in terms of legacy. In fact, it might just kind of be viewed as like, you're lucky you got that fight, because if you just actually defended it against one of the welterweights, you would have lost, for one. But I think we have analogs to this throughout the history of the sport. So I think kind of unfairly, if you go up in weight as a champion and you fight the bigger man and you lose, if that person is also an all-time great fighter or is also a pound-for-pound great fighter, people are actually less inclined to view the size advantage as like being the difference maker. Whereas if the person is just kind of a middle-of-the-road champion, people overwhelmingly say, oh, it's just the size difference. So let's look at some examples. Israel Adesanya went up as the reigning middleweight champion. He went up to fight Jan Blachowicz. And that was Jan's first title defense because he had just beaten Reyes. And Izzy was the favorite, I'm pretty sure. And he lost a close but clear decision. Izzy goes back down. He continues defending his belt. Jan loses his next fight against Glover Teixeira, is never the champion again. So Jan beating Izzy hasn't actually done that much for Jan's legacy. You know, Jan isn't looked at as a GOAT or anything. He's not looked at as a GOAT at light heavyweight. He's looked at as, you know, just kind of another champion, a guy who was kind of underrated, a guy who's presently underrated. You look at some of his close losses against the top of the division, guys like Pereira and Olberg, but like, you know, and Ankalaev, having a close draw with him, like, you know, he's a little underrated, but no one gives him like this just profound air of esteem for having beaten Israel Adesanya. Whereas if Izzy had gone up and beaten him, that of course would have been tremendous for Israel's legacy. That would put him much higher on the all-time GOAT status. Contrast that, though, with, like, Volkanovski fighting Islam and BJ Penn fighting George St. Pierre. In both cases, you've got great champions. You've got, like, pound for pound, contending people. You've got guys who are going to go down in the GOAT lists. And one of them moves up to fight the other and loses. In both cases, I feel like, despite the fact there's the same size advantage, and despite the fact that we agree a size advantage can make you lose to a worse person, like most people kind of viewed Israel losing to Jan as being losing to a worse person. And the same way most people, what I'm building towards, would see it if Islam lost to JDM. Despite that fact, again, the fact that we think you can lose to a worse person just because they're bigger than you, if you fight someone who's also great and is bigger than you, suddenly we think it's less because they're bigger than you and just because they're so great. And it can be both, because sometimes guys go up and they win. Plenty of champions have been, just look at Ilia Topuria, look at Conor McGregor, like look at the double champs. Just look at every double champ. That's what they did. They go up and they beat the person. And sometimes the person they beat is pretty damn good. So it's not totally unfair to like give credit to the winner, even if they're the bigger man. But at the same time, I suspect it's more from the fact that we build those fights up in our minds. We view it as being for all the chips. It's winner take all. The winner is the pound for pound best. The winner is the GOAT. It's those kinds of fights. And we don't want the dissatisfaction of being like, but the winner was bigger, so it kind of doesn't count that much. Yeah. And there's some of that. Like people, gave credit to BJ Penn, and of course people gave credit to Volk and sort of say like, but especially the way the first fight went, where Volk finished so strong and defended himself so well in the grappling, and then the knockout rematch loss was done on short notice. So a lot of people still defended Volk and said, he's pound for pound number one. He's still better than Islam, even if he lost. That was like a size thing. Some people still defended him. But I think people were more willing to seriously look at that and say, the winner, even if it's the bigger guy, is the better man. Whereas when it's, again, a case like Israel going up to fight Jan, Israel loses, goes back down, continues to be the champion, and then Jan goes on to immediately lose in his next fight, we say, he was just bigger, And that's where I'm saying with JDM, like, what does he have to gain from beating Islam? Well, if he goes on to lose immediately, if he goes on to lose to Sean Brady, and especially if Sean Brady then goes on to lose to somebody, like, then it's going to be said, like, yeah, you are not the better man. You are not as good of a fighter as Islam Makhachev. You are not even close to as good of a fighter. You are not even as close to as good of a champion as Islam Makhachev. You only beat him because you are bigger. That will be the narrative. So if he can't keep winning, it's almost gonna hurt him that he beats Islam Makhachev. Whereas, again, if he can have success, if he can, find himself in the position Merab is in, or if he can find himself in the position that Tom Aspinall, we'll see what happens with Gane, but that it was looking like Tom Aspinall was going to be in. If he can find himself in the position that Khamzat Chimaev might be in if he defends his belt a couple more times, where you've sort of cleared out, you've beaten everyone in the top four and everyone else just isn't that good. If JDM can be there, if he can get to that point, and it'll be true that he fought this one of the all-time great fighters who was the champion of the division below, if he can do that, then I think it'll enrich his legacy. In the same way that I think a lot of people, especially people who were around at the time, viewed beating BJ Penn as like a very meaningful win for GSP. That name looks very nice on that resume. Whereas, again, with Jan Blachowicz, Israel's name on his resume is of course good, but it's almost like an anomaly, and it's just not looked at charitably. So that puts, and that kind of puts a weird flavor on the weekend to me, because, obviously I'm very invested, and obviously if JDM can win as a bit of an underdog, that'll be cool. If he can win as the, Islam is a very exciting fighter, but as sort of the more exciting of the two, I'd argue, JDM being the striker. Like, if he can win, if he can kind of use his anti-wrestling to stay off the Dagestani, That'll be an interest. That'll make waves a little bit in the sport in terms of the meta. So that's cool. It'll be an underdog story, like I said. He's got the more thrilling style. You'll certainly be interested to see what else he can do at welterweight at that point. He'll look more like a serious champion. At least, we'll see what happens. If he loses his next fight, then of course everything I just said applies. But at least going into it, you'll be optimistic. At least going into it, you'll be like, okay, this guy is very legit. This guy, because bear in mind, a lot of people when he fought Bilal didn't think he deserved the title shot, because he didn't, and a lot of people looked at that fight as being sort of a match between two guys, neither of whom are necessarily the best in the division. A lot of people, especially this is before Shavkat had the less than inspiring win over Gary. Like a lot of people sort of looked at Bilal and were like, yeah, you beat Edwards, but we're not. You're also old, and we've got someone like Shavkat around, so we're not convinced you're the best. Not that you're a bad champion or unworthy, but we're just not convinced you're the best. We're not convinced you should be the favorite over all of your challengers. And then JDM, it was like, you're just not a deserving challenger. So, that was sort of part of the vibe going into that fight. Is like, whoever wins, I'm just not convinced they're the best welterweight. And yeah, beating Islam doesn't prove you're the best welterweight, but it does legitimize you a little, and just for just because of the name value alone, just because of the stage, just because of the collective stakes alone, it will legitimize him if he can beat Islam, especially if he can beat him convincingly. So that's all well and good, but again, I would restate my points that it's unclear what this means for JDM if he wins. And we won't know until he keeps fighting. We won't know until he either continues to successfully defend his belt a few times or until he quickly loses it. Because if it's the former, all well and good. He's like a great champion. Maybe he's hopping on the pound for pound. He'll certainly be high on the pound for pound list, but maybe he hops on to some GOAT list. Maybe all of a sudden people are looking at him as like a clear top 20 guy. But if it's the latter, if he goes on to immediately lose, he's in Jan Blachowicz situation, where it's like you're just sort of a good fighter, an underrated fighter. You were the champion. Yeah, you fended off the little guy when he came up, but you went on to immediately lose, so we're just not going to count that for much. We're going to mostly attribute that to size, whether that's fair or not. So in some ways that kind of like diminishes the hype a little bit for this weekend, because if the one outcome happens, we don't actually know what it means until potentially years down the road. But in any case, I do think that's how the narrative will play out. Whether that's fair or not, I think JDM's future and his legacy and what this win would mean for him is still very much unclear even after the fact. So those are my thoughts.